I want you to picture a presentation slide in your mind right now.
Yeah.
Just completely minimalist.
Right, stark white background.
Exactly. A stark white background. And right in the center, there's this simple gray line graph. The line comes in from the left, takes a terrifying, like almost vertical plunge downward, forming a really sharp V shape.
A catastrophic drop.
Yeah. But then it turns around
Yeah.
and it starts climbing and climbing and, climbing until it basically goes off the top right edge of the slide, tracing this massive exponential curve.
It's a really striking visual.
It is. Because that deep, dark bottom of the V, that represents the year 1994. And at that specific moment, the economy of the nation we're looking at had essentially flatlined. It was at zero.
Which is hard to even conceptualize.
Right. And I don't mean like a bad recession. I mean a catastrophic historical trauma where, from a purely macroeconomic perspective, the engines of industry, trade, just daily commerce, they had completely stopped.
Banks weren't functioning. Supply chains were just obliterated.
Utterly obliterated. Yet if you follow that same gray line to the present day, you are looking at a gross domestic product that has expanded by a staggering 10 times.
10 times, yeah.
And here's where it gets really interesting. If you look at their control of corruption percentile rank, this same country now ranks higher than 80% of nations globally.
Which is just a massive institutional pivot.
Absolutely. And, we're not talking about a wealthy Western European nation here or like a massive Asian tiger economy with 1 billion people. We're looking at one of the most counterintuitive economic comebacks in modern history, the Rwandan miracle.
Welcome to the deep dive, by the way. And you're right, it really is an unprecedented trajectory. It challenges almost everything we think we know about how nations develop.
So what's our mission today? Because we've got a lot of data to get through.
We do. The mission for our deep dive today is to figure out exactly how that line on your mental graph managed to climb so high, so fast, and importantly, from such an absolute baseline of zero. So we're unpacking a massive stack of World Bank data, demographic research, and institutional metrics to really understand the underlying structural forces. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, we're going to explore 3 specific pillars.
Lay them out for us.
First, a radical structural economic transformation. Second, a relentless optimization of state governance and efficiency. And third, the fundamental rebuilding of human capital.
Those are some heavy pillars. But we should also be clear, right? We're not just going to cheerlead the numbers today.
Oh, absolutely not. Every economic miracle casts a shadow. So we are also going to look at the massive challenges still lurking beneath the surface, specifically a massive agricultural labor pool that is essentially stuck and a looming crisis of inequality.
Yeah, because the graph going up and to the right is, great to look at. But we need to know what's actually pushing it. We need the actual mechanics.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's jump right into the macro miracle and what I'm calling the engine switch. Let's talk about the GDP numbers.
The sheer scale of it.
Right. According to the World Bank figures in our sources, Rwanda's GDP, and this is measured in current U.S. dollars, exploded from that historic low point in 1994 to breaking the $13 billion mark in recent years.
Which is phenomenal.
$13 billion. But here's the thing that absolutely fascinated me when I was combing through these sources. This wasn't just a recovery.
No, it wasn't just bouncing back.
Right. It wasn't just going back and rebuilding the exact same factories or the same farms that were lost. It was a fundamental rewiring of the entire national economy.
A complete paradigm shift.
Yeah, because the spreadsheet paints a wild picture. The value added by services as a percentage of GDP climbed from around a measly 1.3% to nearly 50%.
And that right there is the exact metric that economists obsess over when they look at this case study.
Going from 1% to nearly half the economy.
Yeah, the value added by services jumping to nearly half of the entire economic output. To understand why that is so revolutionary, we really have to talk about the traditional playbook for how a developing nation grows.
Okay, walk us through the standard playbook.
So if you look at the last couple of centuries, the standard model of economic development has been incredibly linear. It's almost treated like a law of physics at this point.
Like step 1, step 2, step 3.
Exactly. You start as an agrarian society where the vast majority of your population is farming just to survive.
Subsistence farming.
Right. Then you undergo an industrial revolution. You take those farmers off the land and move them into light manufacturing.
Like textiles, garments, that kind of thing.
Yeah, simple assembly lines. Then, over decades, as your workforce gets more skilled and you accumulate more domestic capital, you graduate into heavy manufacturing. Steel, Automobiles, advanced electronics.
So that's the path, like the U.S. or Britain took.
Precisely. It's the path South Korea and China took, too.
Right.
And only after decades, sometimes a full century of industrialization, do you finally transition into a service-based knowledge economy.
But looking at the metrics here, it seems like Rwanda they looked at that multi-century ironclad playbook and just tossed it.
They absolutely threw it out the window. They leaped over the traditional industrialization phase almost entirely.
Wow.
Services effectively dethroned traditional agriculture as the primary engine for national wealth accumulation, completely bypassing the factory floor.
Okay, let's unpack this, because hearing you describe that is like a legacy company completely abandoning a dying product line.
That's a great way to look at it.
Like they drop subsistence agriculture
Yeah.
and pivot entirely to high-margin software services.
Yeah.
All while the building they were in was previously on fire.
Exactly. They skipped a whole technological generation.
But doing that with an entire macroeconomy, pivoting straight to high-margin services while the foundational building blocks of heavy industry aren't even there. I have to ask, why?
Well,
Was it just because services are trendy? Or was there a deeper reason to skip manufacturing?
it wasn't about being trendy at all. It came down to brutal geographic pragmatism.
Geographic, how so?
Well, picture a map of Africa. Rwanda is a landlocked country. It's relatively small, and it's highly densely populated. If a nation wants to become a global manufacturing powerhouse, they typically need two things: easy, cheap access to deep-water ports to ship massive containers globally, and massive amounts of cheap, easily accessible natural resources.
And Rwanda doesn't have a coastline.
Right. Rwanda simply didn't have those geographic luxuries. Exporting heavy manufactured goods over land across multiple national borders through neighboring countries just to reach a port in Kenya or Tanzania, it adds a massive transport tax to everything you make.
I see. So if they try to manufacture, I don't know, washing machines?
Sure, washing machines.
By the time that washing machine actually makes it onto a cargo ship, it costs twice as much as one made in a country right on the coast.
Exactly. The geography prices you right out of the heavy manufacturing game. The logistical costs make your physical exports completely uncompetitive globally.
That is fascinating.
So the pivot to services was a strategic necessity for survival. By focusing on services, and specifically we are talking about digital technology, financial services, and high-end ecotourism.
Like the gorilla trekking, right?
Yeah, highly lucrative mountain gorilla trekking. They deliberately chose industries that rely on completely different infrastructure. They rely on internet connectivity, stability, and human interaction, rather than massive natural resource extraction and shipping lanes.
Because a gigabyte of data doesn't care if you're landlocked.
Exactly. You can beam software code to London or process a financial transaction for a client in New York without ever needing a deep water port.
Okay, that makes total sense from a top-down macroeconomic level. You optimize for what you can actually move efficiently.
Yeah.
But I have a major question here.
Go for it.
If I'm listening to this and trying to picture the reality on the ground, I'm hitting a logical wall. If the wealth is coming from services, if half the GDP is suddenly digital and financial, does that mean everyone in the country suddenly became a banker or a software engineer overnight?
That's the million-dollar question.
The data has to have a catch, right? Because you can't just take a population of farmers and hand them laptops. So where are the actual people in this equation?
You've hit on the exact tension that defines the current Rwandan economy. And it leads us directly into what we're going to call the labor paradox.
The labor paradox. Okay, lay it on me.
The wealth shifted incredibly fast, but human beings and their skill sets didn't necessarily move at the same speed.
Right. People aren't spreadsheets.
Exactly. Let's look at the employment modeling estimates from the International Labor Organization that we have in our stack of sources. While the service sector is generating nearly 50% of the nation's GDP, it only employs about 45% of the workforce.
Okay, 45%. That actually sounds somewhat balanced at first glance.
It does, until you look at the other side of the ledger.
Yeah.
Agriculture, the old traditional engine of the economy, still holds on to a massive 53% absolute majority of the workforce.
Hold on, wait. Let me make sure I'm hearing this right.
Yeah.
53% of the entire labor force is still working in agriculture, more than half the working population. But you just said services produce half the wealth.
Precisely. More than half the country is laboring in the fields, but they are generating only a fraction of the nation's total wealth.
Wow.
What we were seeing is a massive structural mismatch between where the jobs are and where the GDP is actually created. Economists call this a crisis of total factor productivity, or TFP.
Okay, for those of us who aren't economists,
Okay.
explain total factor productivity because honestly, it sounds like you're just saying the farmers aren't working hard enough, which I highly doubt.
Oh, it has absolutely nothing to do with how hard people work. It has everything to do with the systems and tools around them.
Okay, give me an example.
Think of it this way. Imagine two workers. One worker has a hand shovel and is tasked with digging a foundation for a house. The other worker is sitting in the air-conditioned cab of a state-of-the-art computerized backhoe.
Right.
Both of them are working an 8-hour day. Both of them are exhausted at the end of it. But the worker in the backhoe moves 1,000 times more dirt.
Okay, that makes sense.
Total factor productivity isn't just about labor. It's about how technology, capital, and efficient systems multiply the output of that labor.
So in the Rwandan service sector.
In the service sector, one worker sitting at a computer coding a payment gateway or managing logistics for a luxury hotel generates a relatively high amount of economic value. They are in the backhoe.
And the farmers.
Because much of the agricultural sector is still traditional, smallholder, subsistence farming, often relying on manual labor and rainfall rather than advanced irrigation, the economic output per worker is incredibly low.
So they're working incredibly hard with the shovel.
Exactly. You
Yeah.
have millions of people tied to the soil, producing very little measurable economic surplus beyond what they need to eat.
So it's essentially two completely different Rwandas coexisting inside the exact same borders.
It really is.
You have this booming glass tower service economy in the capital, Kigali, plugged into the global digital grid, generating massive capital. And then right outside the city limits, you have a vast rural landscape where over half the population is still farming just to feed themselves.
Fundamentally holding the aggregate economy back from its true potential, yes.
But let's dig into the demographics of that farming population for a second, because there is a massive gender shift hiding in these labor statistics that really caught my eye.
Yeah, and this is one of the most vital yet under-discussed mechanisms of their growth. What's fascinating here is the gender disaggregation of this labor data.
Right, because historically, female employment in agriculture there was staggering.
The records indicate it was once near 100% of the female workforce. Women were almost entirely sequestered in the agricultural sector, doing that incredibly hard, low-yield manual labor we just talked about.
But the recent data in our sources shows something totally different.
It does. Female agricultural employment has dropped significantly, down to about 57%.
Which is still a majority, but a huge drop.
Exactly. And concurrently, female employment in the service sector rocketed from roughly 11% to nearly 30%.
That is a massive demographic migration, going from almost every single working woman being tied to a field to almost a third of them moving into services.
It's a seismic shift.
But how exactly did that demographic shift happen so quickly?
Well, the initial catalyst was born of absolute tragic necessity. Following the devastating events of 1994, the demographic makeup of the entire country was severely altered.
There was a massive shortage of working-age men.
Right. Women were forced to step into roles, businesses, leadership positions, and economic sectors they had previously been excluded from, simply to keep the basic functions of society running.
But it didn't just stop at necessity, did it?
No. What is critical to understand is that over the subsequent decades, this tragic necessity evolved into a deliberate, institutionalized structural advantage. Releasing female economic potential has been a massive hidden growth multiplier for Rwanda.
Because you're moving them from the shovel to the backhoe?
Exactly. When you move any worker, but in this massive statistical wave, specifically women, from a low-yield subsistence farming environment into a higher-yield surface environment, their individual economic output multiplies instantly.
They go from producing just enough calories to survive to producing taxable income.
Right. Saving capital in banks and generating domestic consumption. This slow but definitive migration of women from the soil to the service sector is one of the quietest but most powerful engines of that $13 billion GDP growth.
Okay, I see the engine. But even with that migration, even with women moving into services, you still have 53% of the total population fundamentally disconnected from the main engine of wealth.
It's true.
And if I'm looking at this critically, that sounds like a recipe for social unrest. You have half the crew rowing a completely different, much slower boat, while the other half is on a speedboat.
This is a very precarious balance.
Historically, when you have massive, rapid wealth generation concentrated in urban centers, while the rural majority languishes, it triggers massive instability. Riots, revolutions. How on earth did the government prevent the social fabric from tearing apart during this wildly unequal transition?
That is the existential question for almost every developing economy undergoing rapid transformation. The friction of unequal growth is incredibly dangerous.
So how did they manage it?
The answer to how a nation manages such precarious structural shifts without collapsing lies in its institutional guardrails. How strong is the state's capacity to govern, enforce rules, and distribute resources?
Which brings us to our next major area of focus, the institutional moat and global integration.
Exactly. To understand how they kept the ship steady, we have to look closely at the governance metrics. And looking impartially at the quantitative data from the World Bank regarding institutional efficiency, it points to a remarkable anomaly in the region.
Let's talk about that anomaly. Because, when people think of emerging markets, especially in certain regions, there's a stereotype of massive bureaucratic red tape and systemic graft.
Right.
So what do the numbers actually say about how the Rwandan machine runs?
Let's focus on the control of corruption metric. This is a percentile rank that compares a country against the rest of the world, evaluating the extent to which public power is exercised for private gain.
So basically, how corrupt is the government?
Exactly. In the early data sets we have, Rwanda was hovering around the 50th percentile, basically dead average globally.
Okay.
But over the timeline of this massive economic sprint, that rank climbed steadily, relentlessly, and aggressively into the top tier, surpassing the 80th percentile globally.
That is a huge jump, over 80%.
Yes. And context is everything here. In sub-Saharan Africa, institutional fragility, unpredictable regulatory environments, and systemic corruption are very often the primary bottlenecks to economic growth.
Because investors get scared off.
Exactly. It honestly doesn't matter how great your natural resources are or how cheap your labor is if international investors believe their money will be siphoned off by graft, or if the rules change every time a new minister is appointed.
Right. Capital is a coward, as they say.
Capital is a coward. Rwanda looked at that regional bottleneck and systematically bypassed it. They established strict, ironclad anti-corruption controls, digitized government procurement to remove human points of bribery, and enforced exceptionally high government efficiency.
Hearing you describe that, it almost sounds like building an operating system for a computer.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it.
Is that a fair analogy? Like investors or software developers. They aren't going to spend millions of dollars installing their expensive apps, which in this macroeconomic case is foreign direct investment, or FDI.
Right.
They won't install their FDI if the base operating system is full of viruses, malware, and backdoor exploits, which is corruption.
That is exactly how you have to look at it.
Because if the system crashes every time you try to run a business, or if someone demands a bribe just to turn the computer on, capital stays away. So by cleaning out the malware, Rwanda made their operating system incredibly attractive.
They did. And to take that operating system analogy a step further, Rwanda realized their internal hard drive was too small.
Meaning their domestic market.
Exactly. They have a tiny domestic market with limited purchasing power, so they had to become incredibly good at connecting to the global cloud. They needed external money to survive.
Makes sense.
So by systematically cleaning up corruption, Rwanda essentially manufactured trust. And they used that trust as an exportable commodity to foreign investors.
Because they couldn't offer them oil or gold.
Right. They couldn't offer investors massive oil reserves, so they offered them the rarest commodity in frontier markets: administrative predictability.
And do the numbers actually prove this strategy worked?
They prove it flawlessly. Look at the trade data in our sources. Trade as a percentage of GDP experienced fluctuations but stabilized at a remarkably high rate, over 50% and peaking at nearly 70%.
Wow, 70% of GDP is trade.
That means the economy is deeply, fundamentally integrated with the outside world. Furthermore, the foreign direct investment net inflows show a significant long-term structural expansion. International hotel chains, telecom companies, financial institutions, they poured money into the country because the operating system was clean.
Okay, but here is where I have to push back a little bit.
Go ahead.
I see the logic. You build the clean operating system, you attract the foreign capital, you build the glass towers in Kigali. But an operating system needs users.
True.
It needs local workers who actually know how to code, how to provide high-end international customer service at a luxury eco-lodge, or manage digital ledgers.
Yes, it does.
If over half your country is still using the metaphorical shovel in the fields, Where is the human capital coming from to staff all these new, sophisticated service jobs?
Yeah.
Investors will leave if they show up to build digital infrastructure and find a workforce that can't operate it.
You've hit the nail on the head. And it exposes the most fragile part of transitioning to a service economy. A service economy runs on brains, not just brawn.
Exactly.
You can't build a digital hub on the back of physical labor alone. And building that brain power required the Rwandan government to win some massive existential public health battles first.
Health battles, not education first.
Health first. You fundamentally cannot educate a workforce that isn't surviving to adulthood. Before they could teach people to code, they had to keep them alive.
Which brings us to the foundation of it all, human capital.
Right. The demographics paint a really intense picture here. It's a story of raw survival before it even gets to economics.
Let's look at the World Bank numbers on this, because there's a metric here called the Young Population Dependency Ratio. For anyone listening who hasn't encountered this term, in simple terms, this measures how many young dependents kids under working age there are for every working age adult in a country.
It's a crucial metric for economic health.
So in the immediate aftermath of 1994, this ratio peaked at a staggering 114%.
Which is just an immense burden.
Let that sink in for a moment. For every 100 people capable of working, there were 114 children who needed to be fed, clothed, educated, and sheltered. It is an impossible economic burden.
Completely impossible.
But if you look at the recent data, that ratio has plunged to about 75%.
And if we want to understand the mechanics of wealth creation here, we have to understand what that plunging ratio actually means on the ground.
What does it look like for a normal family?
Well, what we are seeing is the dawn of a demographic dividend. Let me explain the economics of a 114% dependency ratio. Imagine a household where only 2 people are working, but they have to support 8 dependents. Every single dollar those 2 workers earn goes immediately to basic, urgent consumption. Buying food, paying for basic shelter, just keeping everyone alive. There is absolutely zero surplus.
Right. There's no money left to put in a savings account.
None. And on a national scale, if households can't save, banks have no deposits to lend out to businesses. The economy starves for investment capital.
And the parents are completely tied down.
Exactly, especially mothers. They are completely tied down by childcare and cannot enter the formal labor market.
So you were literally trapped in a cycle of pure subsistence.
Trapped. But as that dependency ratio drops from 114% down to 75%, the entire macroeconomic dynamic flips.
Because you have fewer mouths to feed per worker.
Right. Suddenly, that household has a tiny bit of surplus income. They put it in a bank. The bank lends it to a local entrepreneur. It also frees up more youth and women to actually enter the labor market.
So the demographic dividend acts as this massive tailwind for economic growth. It generates domestic savings and expands the labor pool at the same time.
Exactly. But as you rightly pointed out earlier, that only works if the workers are healthy enough to actually work.
And the health data here is arguably the most dramatic part of this entire turnaround. The numbers show government health expenditure rose from hovering around a negligible 1% to over 30% of total government expenditures.
A massive reallocation of national resources.
30%. And the result of pouring that much money into health. Under 5, child mortality absolutely plummeted. But the truly staggering victory in these sources, the one that really caught my attention, is the fight against HIV/AIDS.
It's vital that we discuss this because it really challenges how we typically view healthcare in developing nations.
How so?
While in the global north, providing healthcare in developing nations is often viewed through a purely humanitarian lens. It's about saving lives because it's the right thing to do.
Right, it's treated as charity.
Exactly. But the data from Rwanda insists we view it as a hard-nosed, critical macroeconomic strategy. During the period we are analyzing, the HIV/AIDS epidemic was sweeping across sub-Saharan Africa, threatening to completely hollow out the continent's workforce.
It was devastating.
But through incredibly aggressive, widespread, and geographically comprehensive implementation of antiretroviral therapy, or ART, and prevention of mother-to-child transmission, or PMTCT programs, Rwanda successfully contained the epidemic.
Let's break those acronyms down really quickly for the listener. ART, antiretroviral therapy, is the daily medication that suppresses the virus and keeps the person healthy and non-infectious.
Correct.
And PMTCT, prevention of mother-to-child transmission, is the protocol that ensures pregnant women who are HIV positive do not pass the virus to their babies during birth or breastfeeding.
Right.
Now, rolling that out to remote rural villages without paved roads is a logistical nightmare. But why was this specific medical victory so crucial to the economic miracle? Why not just treat it as a health win?
Because of who the virus targets, HIV primarily infects and kills people in their prime reproductive and working years, the 15 to 49 age demographic.
Ah, the core workforce.
That specific age bracket is the absolute core engine of your labor force. If a virus wipes out that demographic, you lose your farmers, you lose your experienced teachers, your civil servants, and your nascent software engineers.
You lose everyone holding the economy together.
And economically, it gets worse. If the working age adults die, they leave behind millions of orphans and elderly parents with no means of support.
Oh, man. So your dependency ratio, that number we just celebrated, dropping to 75%?
It would instantly skyrocket back over 100%. The entire economic model collapses.
Wow.
By investing heavily in massive public health logistics and containing the virus, the Rwandan state wasn't just providing medical care, they essentially built a protective fortress around their most valuable economic asset, their working-age population.
Okay, so they survived the existential health crisis. The workers are alive, the babies are being born healthy, and the dependency ratio is falling. You have your human capital foundation.
Yes, the foundation is secure.
But we are back to the core issue. You still have to train them. And looking at the education data in our sources, this is where the miracle seems to hit a massive, jarring speed bump.
It's a very real problem.
The data indicates that primary education enrollment is sky high. Millions of kids are entering the school system. The access to a classroom is definitely there. But the retention rate, meaning the percentage of students who actually make it all the way to the final year of primary school, swings wildly.
The volatility is concerning.
In the data sets, we see it fluctuating erratically from the 30% range all the way up to the 70% range before dropping down again. That doesn't sound like a reliable pipeline for producing bankers and coders.
It isn't. And this is the critical bottleneck for the entire Rwandan economic model moving forward. Economists refer to this phenomenon as learning poverty.
Learning poverty.
Yeah.
What does that mean exactly?
It is the dangerous illusion of educational success. A government can mandate that every child go to school, and they can secure international aid to build the physical brick-and-mortar classrooms to achieve near universal enrollment.
Which looks great on a headline.
It looks fantastic on paper, but enrollment does not equal learning.
Right.
If the quality of the teaching is poor because the teachers themselves lack training, if the classrooms are overcrowded, if the children are malnourished and physically can't focus on math.
Or if they have to go back to the farm.
Exactly. Most commonly, the opportunity cost of staying in school is simply too high because the family desperately needs that child's labor on the farm to survive. So the child drops out. That wild fluctuation you see in retention rates means the education system's output is highly unstable and unpredictable.
The analogy that comes to mind here, especially when you look at the visual data models for this, is a massive leaky funnel.
A leaky funnel, yes, exactly.
You pour millions of kids into the incredibly wide top of the funnel, that's your high primary enrollment. The government got them in the door. But the bottom of the funnel is clogged with systemic issues, and the sides of the funnel are riddled with holes. Poverty, need for farm labor, poor teaching. By the time you get to graduation at the very bottom, only a fraction of those kids are dripping through to the other side with actual usable skills.
That is a perfect visualization. And if Rwanda cannot patch the holes in that leaky funnel, its vaunted service sector is going to hit a hard, impenetrable ceiling very soon.
Because they skipped the factory floor.
Exactly. Remember our earlier discussion. They don't need millions of low-skilled assembly line workers who just need to know how to pull a lever or sew a hem. They need highly skilled knowledge workers.
Financial analysts, network administrators.
Hospitality managers who speak multiple languages for their high-end eco-resorts. You fundamentally cannot staff an advanced 21st century digital and service economy with a workforce where a significant percentage didn't even consistently finish primary school.
That makes a lot of sense.
The sheer quantity of the workforce is there, thanks to the demographic dividend, but the quality of the human capital is struggling mightily to match the immense, complex demands of the service sector.
This is where we need to take a step back, I think. We've been talking about this whole narrative for a while now as the African miracle.
Right.
We've marveled at the 10x GDP growth, the hyper-efficient corruption control, the brilliant victory over HIV. But looking at that leaky education funnel, and looking at the fact that over half the country is still trapped in low-yield farming.
It's a sobering reality.
And realizing that we haven't even talked about the physical resources consumed to build those gleaming glass towers in Kigali.
Yeah.
I have to play the skeptic here. Are we ignoring the dark side of this growth?
That's a very fair question.
Is it possible to have an economic miracle that leaves half the population behind and essentially rips up the wooden floorboards of the house just to keep the fireplace burning?
Your skepticism is entirely warranted. And you are hitting on the exact, precise vulnerabilities of the Rwandan model. Every single economic miracle casts a shadow, and the data we have shows us exactly where those shadows lie.
So let's talk about those shadows.
It brings us to the final and perhaps most critical part of our analysis, the shadows of growth. Let's look at the environmental cost first, because rapid economic expansion is rarely, if ever, clean.
What do the numbers say?
The data on net forest depletion as a percentage of gross national income is incredibly sobering. Historically, during the most aggressive phases of this economic sprint, forest depletion peaked at over 15% of GNI.
15%.
Yes.
That is a massive, rapid liquidation of natural assets. It's exactly like ripping up the floorboards.
Yeah.
Sure, the fire's roaring today, your GDP looks fantastic on paper, but eventually you have no house left to stand in. You're consuming the country's physical future to pay for the present.
Yes, and that is the inherent danger of what development economists call factor-driven growth in its early extractive phases.
Factor-driven growth.
When a nation is desperate to grow, it relies on its basic factors of production, unskilled labor, and raw natural resources. You are literally pulling wealth out of the ground or cutting down the forests at an unsustainable rate to fund your immediate need for basic infrastructure, roads, and urbanization.
But for Rwanda, that seems especially dangerous.
It poses an existential threat to their specific economic strategy. Transitioning to a green economy isn't just some trendy global north public relations talking point for them. It is a strict macroeconomic necessity.
Because they're small and densely populated.
Exactly. They cannot afford to strip mine their own biome. More importantly, their high-end ecotourism sector, which brings in massive amounts of foreign capital and hard currency, relies entirely on the preservation of those very forests and the biodiversity within them.
Like the gorillas. If there's no forest, there's no gorillas. And no tourists.
Exactly. If they burn the forests to fuel short-term construction, they permanently destroy the foundation of their long-term service economy.
Okay, so the environmental shadow is deep, and it threatens the golden goose of tourism. But the social shadow we touched on earlier might be even deeper, and frankly, more volatile.
The inequality.
Yes, let's look at the wealth inequality data. Despite the GDP going up 10 times, despite the booming service sector, the shiny new tech hubs, and the influx of foreign investment, the Gini coefficient remains stubbornly, uncomfortably high.
For any listeners who might not look at economic indices every day, let me explain the Gini coefficient.
Please do.
It measures inequality on a scale of 0 to 100. A score of 0 means perfect equality. Every single person in the country has the exact same amount of money. A score of 100 means absolute inequality, where one single person has literally all the wealth and everyone else has nothing.
So where does Rwanda sit on that scale?
The data shows Rwanda's Gini index fluctuating consistently between 43 and 52 over this period of massive macroeconomic growth.
A Gini coefficient hovering around 50 is like a massive flashing red warning light on any macroeconomic dashboard.
It absolutely is.
What it proves, unequivocally, is that the immense wealth being generated in the high-tech, financial, and tourism service sectors in the urban centers is struggling to penetrate downwards to the rural poor.
The rising tide is not lifting all boats.
No, it is lifting the yachts in the capital, while the rowboats are still stuck in the mud of subsistence farming.
That's a very accurate way to put it.
And this brings me back to my earlier point. Can a country truly be called an economic miracle if its wealth inequality is hovering around a Gini index of 50?
Yeah.
If you've left half your passengers, the rural farmers, stranded miles behind you on the side of the road with broken shovels, how do you bridge this gap before the social fabric snaps?
That is the ultimate test, and it is what economists call the threat of the middle income trap.
Middle income trap. Let's unpack what that means.
When a developing country first starts growing, it can grow very rapidly by picking low-hanging fruit. You move some labor from farms to cities, you inject foreign capital to build basic infrastructure, you establish basic security, growth explodes. But eventually, all that low-hanging fruit is picked. To transition from a developing nation into a truly wealthy, high-income nation, you must have a robust domestic market.
Meaning your own citizens have to buy stuff.
Yes. Your own citizens must have enough disposable income to actually buy the services, the software, and the goods that your economy produces. If the wealth doesn't trickle down to that 53% of the population still farming, your domestic market remains fundamentally weak, shallow, and poor.
Meaning nobody inside the country can actually afford to buy what the country is selling.
Exactly. And when that happens, you become entirely dangerously dependent on foreign capital and foreign consumers to keep your economy afloat. If the global economy sneezes, you catch pneumonia.
So how do they get out of the trap?
To avoid the middle income trap, Rwanda's future depends entirely on inclusive growth. They have to figure out how to modernize agriculture so those farmers produce surplus wealth, and they have to fix that leaky education funnel so the children of those farmers can actually participate in the digital economy.
They must turn the concentrated wealth of the few into the broad prosperity of the many.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for us? Taking a step back and looking at the whole picture. Let's wrap up this core narrative for the listener.
It's a lot to process.
It is. We started with a V-shaped graph and a nation essentially at absolute zero in 1994. From that total collapse, Rwanda engineered a booming $13 billion economy.
They really did.
They built this astonishing comeback on three main pillars: ironclad institutional governance that wiped out the malware of corruption and attracted global capital.
Right.
A massive, radical shift away from agriculture directly into a service-based economy, completely bypassing the factory floor. And a foundational rescue of their human capital by defeating public health crises like HIV to secure their demographic dividend.
Precisely. It is a masterclass in macroeconomic survival. But as the data demands, we must also acknowledge the severe looming growing pains. Yes. They are wrestling with a stubborn agricultural labor trap where over half the country produces only a fraction of the wealth. They are facing an educational retention crisis that threatens to starve their ambitious service sector of the skilled minds it desperately needs.
And the inequality.
And they are battling glaring wealth inequality and the historical consequences of environmental depletion. The entire future of the Rwandan model depends on shifting away from this initial factor-driven phase where you just throw raw labor, foreign capital, and natural resources at the problem toward a true innovation and human capital-driven era of inclusive growth.
It's a phenomenal high-wire balancing act. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over.
I'm curious what this is.
For centuries, the global playbook for a developing nation was simple, rigid, and entirely linear. You farm, then you build sweatshops and light factories, then you build heavy industry and steel mills.
The standard model.
And then, maybe after 100 years, you transition to digital services and finance. Rwanda looked at that centuries-old rulebook, realized their geography wouldn't allow it, and decided to try and skip the factory floor entirely. They are attempting to go straight from the soil to the cloud.
It's an incredible gamble.
It is. Are we watching a unique, unrepeatable anomaly born of specific post-conflict necessity and landlocked geography? Or is Rwanda actually writing the brand new 21st century blueprint for how a nation rises from the ashes in a digital, hyper-connected world?
Something to really think about.
Think about that next time you look at the global economy and remember that V-shaped line.